It's Dr. Tennant's Verbal Highs. Let's start the show with Lewis Tennant. Here we go. Guests and interviews that you're looking for with creators, innovators, and so much more. For all episodes and further info, verbalhighs.com is the place to go.
Welcome to Dr. Tennant's Verbal Highs, a podcast podcasted from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, New Zealand. My name is Lewis and I'm the host of the show. Kia ora if you are new here, and welcome back if you are a returning visitor. My guest today is Dean Young. Did not know who Dean Young was up until the end of last year when a brilliant local podcast came out. I still didn't actually, to be fair, know who Dean Young was, because Dean Young produced... He just did everything for this podcast. And purposely, as we talked about in this chat, stayed behind the scenes of said podcast. It's called Studio Stories, and I think it might be right up your proverbial alley. Dear listeners, as I say in the chat, I think the demographics of this show and that show probably fairly well align. It's a podcast series, a well-produced podcast series, presenting the voices behind some of New Zealand's most well-known albums. But again, to the demo, where the 90s often comes up on this show, the first four that came out October last year are Shihad's Killjoy, Supergroove's Traction, Devilskin's album, and Dead Flowers' album. What's the Dead Flowers album called? Skin of a Stone, I think it is, and the Devilskin albums We Rise, and they were great. And I chopped them. That's my term for binging them. I chopped them very quickly. I think I might have seen them via a post from John Toogood of Shihad saying, "Hey, we were involved with this, and it was great." I say that to say that the point of the show is that it's voices from those behind the album, with Dean having asked the questions but not actually appearing doing so in the podcast. Just have a listen, it's great. I've over explained it. It's a very good podcast, and I do consider myself someone who you should take podcast recommendations from. I'll come back to that one in a second. While I'm speaking about podcast recommendations, Long Shadow, first series came out in 2021. I missed it. I only listened to it recently. Latest series looks to have come out this year. I'm partway through that. It's an American-based show produced by a very reputable journalist. Very good production, great storytelling, but just super interesting. The first one is about 9/11, which I am sure, like a lot of you, are never-endingly fascinated about, but it's a lot of context I didn't know about. Again, it's put together by an experienced investigative journalist and 9/11 expert. And then the latest one is about the rise of the far right. It's that series, The Rise of the Far Right. This show, again, to remind you, is called Long Shadow. It's just uncanny how it's just the same playbook over and over and over and over from when a lot of this stuff kind of started. You know what I mean? When you listen back to Dean, thanks for the chat. Turned out Dean had a long career in radio, both on mic and on the buttons, which wasn't surprising considering the quality of said podcast, Studio Stories. The catalyst to actually contact Dean and say, hey, do you want to come and chat on the show, is he initially contacted me about the latest episode of the new series, which is focused on Weta's Geographica. And for those unaware, I sadly, but really importantly, it kind of turns out in hindsight, chatted to Aaron Tokiner from Weta at length, both of us having come out of a COVID lockdown. The sadly bit is a week before he passed, so Dean needed some of his voice in the episode, and I said, man, just go for it. It's without saying, you know. That's 2-episode jobby, Weta's Geographica. The first episode is dropped. That's the first episode of the second series, Studio Story, excuse me. I'm going to leave that in. I'm going to bloody leave that in because I'm a human being. Sorry. Like the show, Verbal Highs podcast on Facebook. I don't like it there. Do you follow it? You do something like that. Verbal Highs on X or Twitter or whatever that malarkey is. I should probably shut that one down. What would be really helpful, that hasn't happened in ages, is giving me a rating and even some written feedback if you've got time. It's koha for these episodes. That's the way I look at it. I'm on Apple Podcasts. What else? Verbalhighs.com. I'll get out of your way. No, actually, no, I won't get out of your way because you're going to be listening to me for about another hour. Chat to Dean. Well, listen to Dean. Occasionally interject. Colour commentate.
This is Dr. Tennant's Verbal Highs.
For reasons we'll get to, I've had How Bizarre stuck in my head for the last 2 hours.
You've had what?
I've had How Bizarre stuck in my head for the last 2 hours.
I thought you might go there.
Yeah. So you've listened to a few of these, eh? You've obviously listened to the episode with Aaron.
Yeah, I listened to Aaron's and Gabe's just the other week, I think it was. That was a really good one.
Gabe's?
Yeah.
I agree. It was a delight because I'd just forgotten like how much of a raconteur he is, but also how much he and I kind of got on back in the day. But you don't realise that when you're 21, 22, like you do when you're in your 40s, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that energy was palpable, that we were kind of like, we were enjoying having a robust conversation together again years later.
Yeah. Well, I got that from Aaron as well. And it was, when I was listening to the Aaron one, I just couldn't believe that he passed away that week that it came out.
Yeah, it was pretty confronting because also, as we discussed in the episode, without remembering the exact timings, we'd both come out of that really long Auckland lockdown. So it was kind of the longest chat we'd had with anyone outside our bubbles.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mentioned it on the show before, but it's worth talking about again. I talked to him I talked to him on a Saturday in the afternoon. And so just in case you don't know, what's I don't know, I'm not a woo-woo guy, but what's interesting about the way I do the intro and even the outro is it kind of sounds like a what do you call it when you honor the dead, basically? It sounds like an obituary, but that's actually an intro and an outro that I recorded while he was still around with in mind of him listening to it. And so it came out whatever day it did. He got to listen to it. He messaged me and said, "Oh, it was lovely. I love the way it came out." And then the Saturday following, got up on off the couch and died. Yeah. So you've made an episode about their notorious album, and that there were, and that there was one only from such a great band. It must be such a sense of achievement having 5 eps up now, right? There's not many indie guys in New Zealand making kind of long form doco stuff like that.
Well, I was talking to my my beautiful fiancée Jess, who wasn't with me at the moment. She's currently in Auckland dealing with some health issues, which sucks, but it has to be that way. And I was saying to her, I just, we were sort of reflecting on sort of day one of part one coming out today. Yesterday. And I've said it to her before. I said, I just wish I had more time to put out more than 4 episodes in a season. But there's so much goddamn work, and you'd know yourself, from researching and, finding everything else about that subject, whoever you're going to be talking to, and not writing shit questions.
Absolutely. And then also with your project, for listeners who aren't aware, so yes, some work does go into Lewis talking to one person, doing a bit of a nip and tuck at the end. Yes, doing some research, absolutely, beforehand. But nowhere near as highly constructed as something like you're doing, which is more like akin to a, long form true crime podcast or whatever. So I'd imagine there's all that time storyboarding it and thinking about how am I going to tell this from beginning to middle to end, Yeah.
It's, when I came up with the idea of doing something like this, because obviously, you and I both share a radio background. I kind of gave that part away of my radio career about, when was it, 2012, and after 24 years. And when I was considering doing a podcast, I thought to myself, what would that sound like? Would that be me talking? And the answer I got back was no. It would be someone else doing the talking, and I would do like a intro outro kind of thing. I think for the geographical one, I broke from that tradition because I had to do a little thing in season 2 and part 2, which we'll get to kind of explain things. But I didn't want to be the focal point. I'm naturally, and it's just so weird when I think back on those 24 years on air, I feel like I was probably a square peg in a round hole. because I was never comfortable in the spotlight, never comfortable with being the focal point. I always wanted to be sort of blended into the background.
Which is odd, because you didn't just do afternoons or nights or whatever. You were a Bricky guy for a while, right?
Yeah. This guy for more than
the reluctant extrovert with the large audience.
I'm just not an extrovert. I came up through radio when it was and I remember the day I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A good friend of mine, Jackie, who's been in the game a bit longer than me, and she was saying, we're all extroverts. And I went, what? Are you? And then I instantly sort of felt like I'd found my tribe, even though I'd been with that tribe for a good 10 years at that point, 15 years maybe. And I didn't realize that it's different now, because there's cameras everywhere in studios.
Yeah, I wouldn't dig that. Yeah.
No, and that's part of the reason why I gave it away, is because I was uncomfortable with that. But yeah, back in the day, radio people were introverts sitting in small rooms talking to themselves.
Did I take you off the point you were making there? I feel like you were talking about what happened post being on air when you made the shift.
Yeah. I didn't want to be the focal point. I wanted to have someone else be the focal point. And then I thought, what do I love? What do I want to hear in a podcast? And forever I've always been looking for the making of a certain album, because I'm an audio nerd. Like, I'm a recording engineer and producer. I love knowing about how they got that drum sound, or how, so all those classic albums, TV documentaries about the making of the Dark Side of the Moon and all that sort of stuff. I love all that shit. I love it. So I thought, well, what would a podcast on New Zealand albums that had all those qualities sound like? And that's where Studio Stories began. And so that's where I started to put this thing together. I thought, okay, it'll be documentary style. I'll just chop everything up. I'll have, I won't be in there asking the questions. All my questions are edited out, and they just they weave the story. So the Geographica one, the reason why it took, the better part of 6 weeks to edit is because I had Gabba, Tookie, Clinton, Steve James, and then I had your wonderful archival audio from Aaron.
Yeah.
And I had some archival audio of Tom Larkin.
Yeah.
And the reason why I didn't pick up the phone and go, hey, Tom, do you want to be part of my podcast? Is because I tried to get him on the Killjoy one, and he was super busy. And we were talking back and forth, and it almost happened, and then he just got real busy.
No, I'm right there with you. Like, I've always found him, like, aside from the musicianship, the extraordinary business and mana he's built up in the music industry, I've just always been a guy, even when I was a kid, going to the music shop that Tom Larkin worked at. It's like, if Tom says something, I listen, and it's interesting, and it's entertaining, but it's also informative. Like another kind of raconteur,
He's a great guy too. My little band, my shitty little rock band in the early 90s, was lucky enough to support Shihad on a couple of shows sort of around Killjoy time.
Yeah.
And when I did the Killjoy episode, when I was putting it together, I thought, when I interview John, I'll talk about this particular moment that I'll never forget, because it was really cool.
Yeah.
I was working at a rock station in Rotorua called Rock 99. And Shihad were doing a show at the Ace of Clubs in Rotorua, which was where all the big bands came to play. And John was coming for an interview at our little radio station. And so I drove my nana's little beige Toyota Corolla down to the Ace of Clubs. Oh, hi, I'm here to pick up Tom. John. I'm here to pick up John for an interview. And John was like, hey, bro, how you going? So here I am, starstruck, driving my nana's little car back to the radio station, talking with John fucking Toogood.
Back when he was all piss and vinegar too, and like,
talking about heavy metal and guitars and things like that. And him saying, oh, bro, we didn't use Marshalls, bro. We used Voxes and shit like that. It was fucking cool. He was just talking about Killjoy.
Yeah.
And so I've always had this kind of that in the back of my mind. And I always loved that record like that. And that's from season 1 was the biggest, most popular episode. I just love that album because it's so fucking loud.
Oh, and it's still, the other thing is when albums still are eminently listenable 30 years later or whatever it is,
Yeah.
Actually, for a BFM benefit thing, those guys are playing for free. It's in sometime in the next few months.
Yeah,
says the guy who never goes out to stuff, and it's either Churn but I think I ordered this. I think it's either Churn or Killjoy that they're playing in its entirety. So I think that's my draw to get there. Might be Churn. So before we focus in on you a bit, the introvert probably doesn't want to. Just kidding. But for people who don't know, it's called Studio Stories. You've got the kind of gist of it. We'll chat a lot more about it down the track. First episode of the first series was Killjoy. Second one was Traction, which I feel like you don't even need to mention the band like the first one, but Supergroove, for those who don't know. Devil Skins, We Rise, Dead Flowers, Skin of a Stone. And then Dean and I are chatting now because he messaged me a while back to get some of the footage from me chatting to Aaron. And then I noticed that part 1 of the episodes about Weta's Geographica dropped a couple of days ago. So I said, look, we should chat now because I think my audience is pretty much your audience. It's going to immediately cross over. It's the same demographic.
Yeah, pretty much.
So as you can tell by the guests on my show, so you just surprised me then and said 2012 you bowed out on air after 24 years. So did you start in 1988 on air? You must have been freaking young.
I started in my maths is probably shit. I started in 1992.
Yeah, that's what my research says. Anyway, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Yeah, whatever. 20 years, long time. But you must have been pretty young to be on air.
Yeah, I was 19.
Yeah.
I was essentially, I remember having this conversation. I have a lot of conversations with myself. I had a conversation with myself one day when I was thinking about what I wanted to do for a job.
Yeah.
And I said, if you could do anything, what would it be? What would you do every day? What would you love? And I said, I would like to work with music.
Yeah.
And even back then, I was like, I don't want to be on the radio.
Yeah.
But I want to work in radio somehow. The first thing I really wanted to do was record music. That's the only thing I ever really wanted to do. So it's kind of funny that radio sort of popped into my mind, and then there was a guy in Rotorua. Rotorua is where I grew up, essentially from the age of 10 through 24.
Yeah,
and there was a guy who ran a recording studio there called Noel Lamberton. And Villa was the name of the studio, and I was like, I'll go and see Noel, and see if I can get a job or whatever. When I was about 17, I think, and I had a really good chat with him. He was really patient with me and really nice, and he said, I started in radio, and I went, so it was a nice little sort of full circle moment for me. I thought, okay, well, there's my starting point. To get to where you are, sitting behind that desk in this fucking cool studio, start in radio. So he started doing, he was recording ads and things like that when he started. So that's where I began the whole journey. So the reason why I got into radio was because I wanted to learn how to record.
And what's interesting about the timeline of your trajectory is radio in New Zealand, broadcasting was deregulated in 88, 89, but to my mind, there was still, the radio scene and industry of old back then for quite a few years. And what I'm getting at is the industry you came out of looks quite different. Like the idea of getting involved with radio for music and to get your hands on to equipment to make stuff, there was more opportunities around there, right? Because kind of capitalism and technology has streamlined that thing into a couple of boxes, if I'm to be overly cynical about it. I'm not saying we don't still have production engineers and so on, but I'm not saying we don't still have playlists, but on those provincial stations, there probably was more opportunity to play a few DJ choices and so on as well, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. And it was such a neat time too, because there was still a bit of debauchery around, and there was still, the quite full-on parties. And there was some real characters who I will never forget as long as I live. Some really funny, interesting, wonderful people that I'm still friends with to this day.
Yeah.
One guy in particular, Ray, who'll probably listen to this, Ray Hahunga, who was essentially the guy who trained me in production, radio production. And I really looked up to Ray because he was the production engineer at Geyserland FM, where I started. And
Geyserland, awesome.
Yeah.
Just the name is so Rotorua.
Yeah. 97.5.
Yeah.
So Ray really wanted to record music as well, but he never had the opportunity. So when I turn up there with all my little bogan mates who also wanted to do radio,
Yeah.
we were obviously all in bands. And so at Geyserland, it was a studio that was built in the 60s. So it had this beautiful live room with all the wood paneling and the piano riser and everything. And it was being used to store old records and accounts. So we actually, I don't know how we convinced the manager, Dave, to clear it all out, but we managed to get him to clear it all out so we could demo our bands in there. And it had a 16-track tape machine and a few bits of outboard. And we used to go around sort of like, we'd record at night. And I still remember going into all the studios and pilfering all the SM58s and just putting them all on the drums, not really knowing what we were doing. And
hey, it's still a reasonable mic. It might not be a drum mic, but yeah.
And it sounded fine.
Yeah.
It sounded amazing to us because it was the first opportunity we ever had, and we didn't know anything. So first thing we did was we put the drums in the vocal booth. So it was drummers sitting.
I sometimes like with my students these days, I encourage it. It's happened every now and again, but the idea of like in our production studio, which they have access to when they're in third year. I'm like, this beautiful this treated room, what happened here at night, I probably wouldn't know about, just as long as everything was plugged back in at the end. But it seems to be less thirst for that these days. But I realize as I say that, it's actually probably because if you are making music and stuff these days, you've got so much more access to, they come on up with laptops and stuff, and that's how they're used to doing their production and so on. So how did you, like when I talked to Nathan, I just realised how long this podcast is because I talked to Nathan years ago now. He kind of spoke of, this is not the exact story, but basically riding up there on his bicycle when he was in high school and then getting asked back. What was your in? Did you, using your voice that you just did for when you met John, did you go to the radio station and go, hello, do you have any work going? Or and they said, I'll come in and volunteer for a while, or?
I think I used the Yellow Pages or the phone book or something, or I found out that there was, I don't know if you ever remember, there was these things called Access courses.
Yeah.
And there was an Access radio course in Rotorua, and it was run by a gentleman, I forget his name. He was a wonderful guy. He was I think he was an ex-radio engineer, so he was he used to work with transmitters and things. And he knew anything and everything there was to know about sort of hooking up a transmitter and making a radio station go, right?
Yeah.
And so he was kind of like the caretaker of the radio station. So he wasn't really the guy that kind of trained us was a guy who'd been probably in the game himself for about maybe 5 years at the time, and he worked at 96 FM. And then he kind of left. And so we were like, I turn up there and I was like, I want to learn how to do production, radio production. And they said, well, you've got to go on air first. And I went, I don't really want to go on air. And they said, well, this is how we run the thing. Like we need people to be on air to run the little radio station, which was on the frequency 99 FM. And it was run by the local iwi. And so it was an iwi frequency, and it was a training station. And so I went, oh, okay. And about maybe a week later, I was in there, and they said, the previous students have all left. You're on this afternoon.
Yeah.
And I went, and the only training I'd had really was reading a mock weather forecast to the gentleman who was the caretaker of the radio station. He didn't know a good one from a bad one. Do you know what I mean? So I was shitting myself. And if you imagine the studio was, it's not like it is now. A radio studio now is basically a computer and a mixer, right?
Yeah.
mics.
Yeah.
Back then, we had 2 turntables, we had 1 CD player, 2 cart machines, and a cassette player. And so the scheduling for the music was like a card system. So it was like you'd flip through, you'd play whatever song it was, and then you'd put it at the back.
Yeah.
So it's really simple. And they were all sort of labeled, I think, A, B, C, D, or whatever. So on your schedule, you're playing A, and then you're playing a B, and then you're playing a D, or whatever.
Yeah.
But you couldn't have 2, like you'd go to the A, and you'd pull out a CD, right? But if the next song that was scheduled was also a CD, you had to find the same song on a record, because there was only 1 CD player.
Oh, so you had to like do a DJ mix, but of the actual same song into the song.
Yeah. Well, no, you had to try and find.
Oh, I see. You had to find an alternative copy because you had to line up a CD next. Yeah.
Yeah, because you couldn't play 2 CDs in a row. And so I just remember it was a nightmare. Like I was shaking. I was so afraid. I was absolutely beside myself. Like I was really aware that I was not doing well. But at the same time, there was something about it that I really enjoyed. And I don't know what it was. But
I think it's that it is a whole lot of stuff that you were totally into, but it's also like, that fear is a sign of exhilaration, right?
It was a bug. Is when I call it the bug. Is what it was.
Yeah.
And so that little training station kind of got taken over by 96 FM and turned into like a summer station, sponsored by Coke. And the idea was that they were trying to get, take some audience away from Geyserland FM, which was the other big station in town. And so it was still a training station, and we had marginally better gear, but not great gear. But that was the point where I started to experience a bit of breakfast radio.
Yeah.
And kind of enjoyed it. And then when that radio station kind of folded and fizzled out and turned into Rock 99, that's when it got taken over by Geyserland FM. So then I thought, oh my God, I'm going to get production training. Like this is it. Like this is where I start my journey kind of thing, which is exactly what happened. But I also got to do a bit of breakfast radio. I was somehow good enough to get on Geyserland and do a night show, and I got to write ads, and I got to do all of those things.
Very similar to like, it's those kind of, when you compare it to the duopoly these days, MediaWorks and the other one, it's those, I totally relate to your story, those more kind of, let's call them mom and pop operations are where you do get to do a whole lot of stuff, because it's a resource thing as well. It's often like, oh, he's around, he can have a go at that because we need this thing done as well.
That's right.
I tell you, I did a really long research project for Audio Culture. I did a history of Radioactive, which is, I'm sure you are well aware, as Wellington's student station and has been since the 70s. And so I'm not quite of your vintage in that I don't remember the flip card system when I came on air, but I did find a hilarious story from an old salient from a PD back then. I quoted someone from an article written in the 80s where he was like, that's going well with our DJs, but sometimes we have a problem where a DJ comes on and he's too out of it and he plays the last person's show backwards because you've just explained the card system. So a lot of people going, I don't get that. Why is that funny? It's because if you go in with the card system, it's like playing a board game where you start pulling out the questions that have already been asked, right?
Yeah.
So if you start going the wrong way, and an astute listener will go, this music's all really familiar. It's like, yes, it is. It's because it's the same show from end to beginning.
So
yeah. And so, like, what are the key changes you saw over the years?
The main one was the internet.
Yeah.
I actually remember we weren't allowed to say, when Spotify started, we weren't allowed to talk about Spotify on the radio.
Yeah.
You weren't allowed to say Spotify.
Yeah.
Because there was so much paranoia around in the radio industry that people were going to immediately turn you off and turn Spotify on, and then that would be it.
Yeah.
So I remember that, and everyone was scared shitless about Spotify, and then it kind of just became another thing, and then Apple Music came along, and then another, all these other platforms started. So there was that, but then there was this, the other facets of the internet started to sort of creep in, where it was, there was the podcast side of things.
Yeah.
We can take our highlights and make a podcast out of it. That started to creep in. There wasn't any kind of filming going on in the studios like there is now. Every studio's got cameras set up everywhere.
Yeah.
That hadn't begun at this point. I think they'd started doing that upstairs at News Talk, because News Talk had all the money and they could do anything they liked, and it was like the Starship Enterprise up there,
And that just to cut you off quickly, that what I call repurposed radio podcast, to their credit, even though it's not what you and I would say is a podcast in terms of the form, they rate their tits off. They're always at the top of the iTunes charts and stuff. And, they're a great way for those companies to, recycle, reuse, reappropriate content. So it's been really interesting for me lately, seeing them also in the same breath, trying to figure out how to actually get a whole lot of podcasts happening, which they have done to differing degrees of success. But yeah, it really is like, what you're saying about does sound analogous to like when Napster came along and the record labels, right, in terms of how those things changed. Not to the same extent.
Yeah, very similar. That kind of, yeah.
What about you? I was surprised you said that from that. Well, no, I wasn't. That's completely wrong. I wasn't surprised you said that at all, because it makes total sense and I agree. But I surprised you didn't go a little bit earlier on, because for me, it was something else that you said. In that when I was doing the Brecky show on Active, or any show on Active actually, and a huge part of the appeal for me as someone who got into DJing as well and was interested in production like you, was the physicality and the timing of doing a show. Right. When will I play my cart? When will I drop that record? What sting will I play over that? And now I teach this stuff to my students. I regret that I can't teach them that, because the desk just doesn't work like that now. It's got two mic faders. It's got faders for the two RCS computer tracks. And, I'm not saying you can't do that, and you still hear people doing artfully timed radio. Maybe I'm being horribly old-fashioned and wish everything was still a record player, which I don't, because I'm fully embraced digital. But I think there was something in playing a broadcast studio like a musical instrument when you got really good at it. Discuss. And I'll just say discuss. Yeah, that's right. Nail the intro. Well, you can still do that. They've still got to do that. That thing, there's a term for it that you'll probably know, because I didn't come up in the traditional industry, but when you exactly nail a voice break and then the drop or the first guitar chord hits or whatever.
Yeah. For me, it was definitely all of that sort of stuff once I caught that bug. But the other part of it was being, working as a part of a breakfast show team.
Yeah.
And that energy.
And that's timeless. That hasn't changed. A good team's still a good team. And it's about the casting of the program. The program director is essentially like a casting agent, getting the right people that have synergy together.
That's right.
Yeah.
And when I worked with Willie DeWitt and Dean Butler on Hauraki, 08 through 2011, 2010, something like that, that was an education, because I saw those two guys would come up with the show that morning.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't be prepping the day before or anything. They would come up with the show that morning. So I'd come in, we'd shoot the shit, blah blah blah.
So it's three of you hosting Brecky.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so Willie and Dean would trundle off into the office and start writing, and I'd keep the music going and blah blah blah. And the show would technically start at 7 when they'd start rolling out their bits, and they'd bring me in on bits, and we would create stuff on the fly, and it was incredible. And one thing that always stuck with me as well is what Willie said to me once. He said, that studio door is the stage door. So we're walking onto a stage.
Yeah.
They were performing. That was a performance. Every morning was a performance for them, which was so incredible to see. Like, they would finish each other's sentences. They knew each other so well.
It's the same thing, with the mic button, you talking about, thinking about cameras coming in. Like, I did Brecky very young, and, I was going out a lot more at night and a lot later. And so that thing of like, I don't look my Sunday best. But as soon as that mic goes on, you sound like the most chipper, the most chipper, welcome to your morning person in the world.
Smoking mirror.
The school of Mikey Havoc.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah. So like, what was your? I mean, thinking about teams again. I talked to my students about this, about sort of complementing. You know, what archetype were you? You know what I mean? And how each person's. Who were you in that group? Were you the?
Well, it kind of changed.
Yeah, right.
You know, it changed, and that's kind of that's the other part of breakfast show radio.
Yeah,
changed for me because I was always the guy that did the stupid fucking voices and the silly characters and the impersonations.
The guy who's not an extrovert.
Yeah. But no one ever knew it was me.
Right.
So I go out of my way to make it as convincing as I could possibly make it.
Yeah.
So it sounded, I would vary speed the tape machine, and I would do everything possible to make that the most convincing character or whatever it was that I could. That really started to dwindle and leave breakfast radio pretty soon after I finished. Probably it was dwindling as I was.
Oh, do you mean like that being a fashionable or sort of thing to do? Yeah.
Thing.
The kind of like almost, that's kind of sort of morning zooey kind of. Yeah. So I read that when it said, I was sorry to get back to your point in a sec, when it said that I found somewhere that you could do a credible Homer Simpson. So can you really?
Yeah.
You know, I won't make you do it. Maybe at the end.
Yeah, maybe at the end.
You'd say, can we say donuts when we finish?
I drove my band members crazy because we did a little mini tour, and for the entire tour, I was in this little van trying to get Homer right.
So you went method, but you hadn't actually figured out the method. Yeah, I could see that, how that would be annoying.
I was going, is this better? And I'd do it, and they go, nah. And I'd go, what about now? 2 hours later.
Yeah.
Being in a van with someone that annoying.
But I just realised that's when you're like producing music and you listen to the same thing over and over again. By then, they don't know which Homer's good. It's like we've heard 6 hours. We don't know how he's evolved.
Go back three. That one. Something about that one was quite good. So that was part of how breakfast radio was changing. Was kind of on the way out, and I really, in the end, sort of became the anchor, and I feel like I got quite good at being the anchor, but, and letting the other people in the team shine. And I quite enjoyed that. I quite enjoyed moving into almost managing that. And
room. So who gauges that? Who licks their finger and puts it in the air and says, breakfast radio is changing? Is it through audience surveying or just hearing what's going on in other stations? Or it's about a skillful program director, isn't it? Or whatever they call them these days.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of that came from, I had multiple PDs, program directors, who would read Radio and Records, the publication. It was like a big magazine that would come out. It was an American industry magazine that would come out. And they would read that from cover to cover, and they would almost choose the playlists from what was charting in America, and that also went right through into what's the breakfast show doing at the moment? What's the drive show doing? What are the trends in those shows?
That's interesting. So we look to the US and the.
I think we used to.
Yeah. Well, no, there is no surprise with that. I'm not surprised. It's because we sort of looked to the UK for a lot longer in New Zealand, didn't we? But I guess that's where, where it's seen the cooler radio was coming out of at the time. Maybe because it wouldn't have been before that, would it? It would have been the UK, would have been the influence.
Yeah.
But then again, I'm thinking about it on the spot. That was the perception I reckon the perception that the UK would have seemed stuffy is, even though there's still a whole lot of great radio coming out of there. We'd got away from being that, sounding faux British, because that's how broadcasting sounded before our time. So we probably wanted to get as far away from that as possible, right?
And I know when that probably would have happened.
Yeah.
And that would have been the deregulation, which was 1991 or something.
Well, that thing where you couldn't even sound like your own accent, or like a New Zealander. I mean, that had to change, didn't it? Right.
That's right. That's right. And the newsreaders, there was still a lot of newsreaders who would sound a little bit kind of like this.
Yeah.
And that was that hangover of that BBC kind of NZBC kind of thing,
I did a wee research project at work with a bunch of New Zealand podcasters, and one of them said something real interesting to me I hadn't thought of. I don't know whether this is that's really what the case is, because it was, after all, his reckons. By the way, one person's reckons are reckons, but a whole lot of people's reckons become data. There you go, everyone. I've explained academic to you. But he was saying that he reckons, because all the podcasts he listens to, he's heard a change from that kind of casualization of delivery that's coming across on TV and radio now. You know what I mean? I thought, that's interesting. Like, cause a lot of people are listening to pods and stuff now, and it's like, it's that whole, it's not just podcasts, it's YouTubers, it's all of that stuff where people now arguably want more kind of relatability and chat that's near them, rather than, like you say, the kind of authoritarian kind of news read or whatever. And you
that was where breakfast radio was moving from characters and silly shit into conversations.
Yeah.
That is the change right there. That's what people wanted to hear more of. They wanted to hear more of what was going on in your life. Even though you've got a voice that sounds like, you're from another planet or something, Well,
you probably wouldn't even have three dudes on a breakfast show these days, would you?
No.
Yeah, it's interesting. No. It's all. Things change for a reason, and that's I think that's a good change.
And I think it's amazing as well. I was reading something today in Pod News that podcasters are now more trusted than news media. Yeah. They're way more trusted.
I'll put that on my business card.
Yeah, selling point.
I had James Cridlin, the guy that writes that out for the Podcasting Summit event that I've been running the last couple of years, which I'll send you a link to if you're not aware. If you can make it down to Auckland, it's just an opportunity to get, we've just kind of talked about. It's often thankless tasks that you do on your own. Just a room for us all to get into once a year.
Yeah.
I run it at the uni. Hey, indulge me, because I'm allowed to, because it's my podcast, everyone. I'm interested in audio production. Another thing that stuck out to me is that you decided in the late 90s to invest in a digital audio setup at home, a recording setup, which back then was probably, a more difficult and more expensive proposition than now. How did that go? Was it quite a serious setup to begin with, or?
Well, it was one of those Roland. It was a Roland VS.
Yes, 2480?
No, that was expensive. I got the 880, I think, to start with. Then I got the 1680, which was a leap up a few years later. But the 880 ran off those, what were they called? They were called Zip Drive.
Yeah. That's how you used to deliver gig posters and stuff to people as well, back when a Photoshop file filled up a whole zip drive. You'd send that to the printer, get plates made,
Yeah. So you'd use zip drives. And it was great because I'd gone from learning how to record on tape, and I'd had conversations with the local, music store in Rotorua. Hey, like, what's it like to record on computers? Is that happening? And he was like, yeah, but it's, and this was kind of like 96, 97. I think Pro Tools came out at 96 or something like that.
Maybe early 90s, and then they made it so it could be accessible on a normal. They made it so it could be accessible without the box or whatever. Early 2000s, so that actually didn't happen for quite a while. I think it's 2001 or 2 that version came out that you could run on a regular computer.
Yeah. But I remember him saying that it wasn't. It was still not there really. So that's why I went with the hardware thing, and I just thought I'm just going to record myself and see what happens. And so that's how my first sort of musical, like, for lack of a better term, solo stuff, because it was just me, kind of happened. It was just me kind of, I think I was in Tauranga and I put out a little EP and I was really pleased with it. And then, it kind of just went from there. I improved and got up to the 16 track. And then I think I eventually landed on, I didn't land on Pro Tools until 03 or 04.
But did it feel like, fuck, I've spent a lot of money back then? Because again, like that whole pro audio industry is really big now, and it's an arms race to sell stuff to people. So
it was really expensive. I remember the 1680 was like $3 or $4 or something like that. The 880 was a lot more affordable. So the 1680 was a leap up, but it was 24-bit.
Yeah.
So immediately you could hear all this stuff that you weren't hearing before.
Yeah.
I was. Maybe it was my imagination.
Yeah. I don't know if I can still hear the difference between 16 and 24, but I'll give it to you.
Well, do you know what I immediately thought was, oh my God, I've got low end.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, I could.
There's more defined lows, more information on the low end.
Yeah.
I think when you at the other end of the scale, I think when you get in today's audio, if you go up to 88.1, or if you go any higher than that, then the highs are really crystalline and really, really, like, if you've got good mics and stuff, it's like really detailed.
Yeah, I just realized you're producing instruments and music. I'm just thinking voice and stuff where it's not so pronounced, but you're right. If I was
going to
produce my Jamaican dub,
nice.
I definitely need that. Yeah, definitely need those extra bits.
Yeah. I guess it's just detail. There's more information. So
and to round off this convo before we lose everyone except the nerds. For everyone, the reason that Pro Tools and so on wasn't quite there back then, or whatever systems in the 90s, to my mind, not only obviously software development, but just everything we talked about, processing power and storage is secondary. But it's amazing what everyone's laptop can do these days. Even a $600 or $700 laptop can cope with some pretty basic editing pretty well that you would have years ago got the spinning wheel of death every now and again.
Right? Yeah. It's incredible these days what you can get, and what you can get for your money as well is phenomenal, and the evolution as well. I mean, I stumbled across this, and I don't know if you know about this plugin.
Hit me. I'm here to learn too.
This plugin is called DX Revive. Have you heard of DX Revive?
No.
But your new favorite.
Yeah.
Because what it can do using AI and machine learning.
Oh, wow. Okay, here we go. Yeah.
It can actually take a voice that kind of like, say, the NASA astronauts. Yeah. And it can almost make it sound like they're talking through a microphone. It replaces and draws on all its AI and machine learning to recreate those bits that have been sort of crushed and mashed up.
Hang on, so I'm taking your real voice. So I think you threw a curveball with the astronauts thing. It could be anyone, right? So it takes anyone's voices and makes it sound like it's coming through a microphone. Is that right?
Here's an example with the Geographica episode of Studio. Gabba, bless him, was talking through a laptop microphone, which was really thin sounding and really echoey because he was in a bedroom or whatever. Yeah. So with DX Revive, you run DX Revive over that, it takes the reverb off. Then it replaces all of the stuff that's missing. So it adds low end and it rebuilds the voice and makes it almost sound like studio quality microphone. If I was to A/B the original of him with the DX Revive version, it'd be like, oh my God, that's unbelievable. The difference is so incredible. And all those artifacts as well.
That would be handy for, like I said to you, and you have shown up with a good mic and headphones, bless you, because Zoom recording is a dark art. We are getting a little bit of that uncanny valley thing now, but I've learnt when to stop and start talking. If I go over you, we do cancel each other out. But I say all that to say, I hope he's not listening again. I've mentioned this on about 5 or 6 shows, and I love this guy to death. One of my guests who I already knew as a friend, who is in recording studios a lot, let's say, rocked up to record his ep in a really echoey wooden Wellington house with a laptop mic, no headphones, and his kids running along the floor above him. But I say that to say that it sounds like what you're talking about there might have cleaned that up quite well. Adobe are doing a product as well, which is in the standard suite, which we offer our students, which I haven't tried yet, maybe because it's that fear of being made obsolete. But apparently, it does a really good job of cleaning up audio through AI. Let's get out of the nerd tube, and because this next thing relates to that. It's a good segue. Okay. I read the quote from you in that New Zealand, Australian kind of podcast website, which looks interesting. I'll look at more. Oh, yeah. You said about Studio Stories, the challenge in making the podcast was to get that information without going down super nerdy wormholes, And if we do, we try and make it interesting to someone who doesn't have the faintest interest in how much compression was on the kick drum, So yeah, again, I'm coming back to sort of thinking about story and stuff, like I talked about at the beginning. Did you just go by kind of feel of what would, impact the widest audience possible, or did, like, for example, did you play it to your girlfriend that you talked about, or how did you kind of assess whether it was pitched right for what you wanted?
It's tricky, right? Because there's a big part of me that goes, just leave that part in, because it's so interesting. I think what it is there's a bit of nous there from the radio background, which is always know who you're talking to, know your audience, essentially. So when I'm chopping these interviews up, that's kind of in the back of my mind. Is a layman, I hate using that term, but as a layman listening to this, tuning out, going, I don't even know what that is.
Yeah.
What are you talking about right now? Having said that, you would know if you've listened to the Traction episode, it does get super nerdy because Carl, who was the front man, it still is the front man in Supergroove, he was the producer as well, and he is a uber music and music production nerd. And so I felt like a lot of what he was saying, kind of especially near the end there, was all really vital to what that album actually came out to be, which was this really incredibly interesting textured record that I never really realized when I listened to it in the mid-90s. And
also just realize, like, let's not forget the series is called Studio Stories, not like hilarious shit that happened in the van on the road stories, right? So you do have, you do have to fulfill that at the same time. Yeah,
it's a balance, right? You get the idea is that, and I encourage the guests, like, before we press the record button, if I've got a question for you and you want to go off on the tangent, go for your life. Like, I encourage stories because that's what it's all about. And I selfishly wanted to do Killjoy and Traction and Skin of a Stone because those are the albums that I learnt how to record from listening to.
Yeah.
So I was listening to Traction going, oh man, I want to record a drum kit like that one day.
Yeah.
With Skin of a Stone, I was like, oh my God, those vocals are great. And with Killjoy, it was like, oh my God, those guitars are immense. How did they do that? Like, selfishly, I wanted to get that information out. But yeah, you're right. It's like it's a balance. So I feel like if I give the audience enough cool stories and interesting things about, oh yeah, that is a foot tapping in the background of that breakdown in that song that I always wondered. I thought, oh, is that a metronome? But it's not. It's a foot tapping.
But also, as you, I'm sure you're acutely aware of, I hinted at a much more general audience, and that there are a lot of people that have music in their life and they like it, but they're not kind of the more obsessive types about music. So even if you're not a production person, if you come to a podcast that's about a bunch of albums, but I think you know what I mean. There's plenty large audience that is the nerdy audience who aren't necessarily studio or music producing people. They just like to know everything they can about and those guys always know more than the general population about a stage setup or they know the basics of it. So and I'm probably more in that camp in terms of music production than the people you're dealing with. So I'm totally interested in it. Yeah. And how do you garner? This is what I found hard. And for me, it's never been something I've sort of like felt any grief over because I get what podcasting is, and also I've got a luxury now where I have a full-time gig. I have a safe job the last however many years, whereas I used to kind of go from contract to contract. My point is, so this is a kind of a enjoyable passion project for me, but what it's getting to is there is this thing with podcasting where you don't really hear, or like the phone doesn't ring in the studio, the text thing doesn't go, you don't hear people, you don't talk to people who say, oh, that thing you said on breakfast was really funny the other day. Yeah. Very long way of getting to what you probably know I'm going to ask you is like, how have you garnered what audiences people think about it? How have you got a sense of who's listened to it and that? Is it just mates saying, oh, it's really great? Or
look, I don't.
Because it's just data, isn't it? All we get, for anyone who don't know, is you sign up to a analytics service and you just get a bunch of numbers,
That's right. That's all you get.
But
so it is a little bit kind of like, I wonder if I'm hitting the mark here sort of thing. I just figure that, you know, if I can put something together that sounds good, that makes sense, that's interesting and entertaining and informative, if I'm ticking all those boxes, and then as a package sounds good and the presentation is good, then, you know, I've won. Like, if I'm proud of what I'm putting out, like, and the Geographica one is a really good example of, I wanted to do that episode justice for Aaron, who I never knew.
Yeah.
But had an immense respect for. Met, I think once, we kind of met, his band was jumping up on stage to sound check at a gig that we were playing at as well as support. And he was just hilarious. He was so funny. That's the one thing I remember about him. And then they get up on stage and they start playing, and I'm like, my God.
Yeah. And the other thing not to lose sight of, and it was actually someone that told me this, you know, it's good when audiences, friends, whatever, tell you things you hadn't really thought about, is like, you've made a resource that's not going anywhere. You've made a historical artifact. You've made a record of, especially, this has come up before on the pod, I'm sure, different contexts, like pre-internet, there wasn't as much around. Do you know what I mean? There's not as much of a footprint. There's pretty much none of my main years on the radio online, which is I'm totally fine with. But you know, that era in particular, these things need to be made. You know, and the thing that I noticed, I don't know who's doing it. Someone at the National Library's onto it, and they've started archiving episodes of my show, and the same will happen with yours. You know, and wow. Yeah, I think someone's just onto it, looking at what's out there. But they're really handy resources. I mean, here's an example. One of many. My students have to make a short music feature every year about a New Zealand artist or album. So there you go. There's one more thing there. And for the artists as well, the people you're dealing with, you know, they got another keepsake as well. Have they all been stoked, what you've given them? Surely.
They've been really great.
Yeah.
No one in season 1 said no.
Yeah. No, but I mean, after the fact, like, have they listened to it and gone, yeehaw?
Yeah. I'm friends with Ricky from Dead Flowers. We've been friends for a very long time, and he really enjoyed it. Carl was very complimentary from Supergroove. Not sure about the Shihad guys, but I'm pretty sure.
I think they're just, like you say, really busy and these days doing a lot of their own thing. And
the Devil Skin guys are great as well, and of course the Weta guys, who I now class as friends, because we've had such a lovely connection.
Yeah, and
they're all such good guys. Like, they're just such
good
human beings.
Well, also they, you know, I mean, God, so much time's passed, but my observation, talking to both Gabes and Aaron, just some of the things they said, and just, it makes sense observing what happened over the years from afar. I think you've caught them at a good time, because I think that if either of us had talked to them about Geographica, maybe even 4 or 5 years ago, it wasn't right, because it's just this is just my observation. I don't know how correct it is. I think it was such a big thing for them, and such a big thing to kind of lose or to walk away from, that I just think there was a long period there that was much longer than a decade, where they I don't know. I just remember Aaron sort of saying that on the he said something like, "Oh, it's only been recently that I've realised why everyone's come up to me over all the fucking years, or however he says it, all the fucking years, and said to me, like, you know, oh, what a great album." He said, only recently I've started to go back to it and realise the same thing, you know.
I think that's actually on the podcast. That very clip.
Yeah.
You'll hear at the end of...
Hey, before I forget, because you were willing to share something that's in an episode that's coming up, it's no spoiler thing, obviously, you said you made a second part of the Weta one, which is unusual because, and then you said we'll talk about that later. Why have you made a second episode of that particular album? The Geographica album, sorry, I shouldn't just say Weta. That's what it's about. It's about that album.
Yeah. So much information.
Yeah.
It got to editing, and I had an episode that was sort of over an hour long.
Yeah.
And I used pretty much, like, it's rare that I would go through and that I would use everything, but I've pretty much used everything from everyone.
Wow.
And because I wanted to, because it kind of completed the story, and because this episode in particular is, I've never had as many voices in an episode. So She Hard was only 2, Super Groove was 3,
Yeah.
Dead Flowers was 3.
Yeah.
This is 4, 5. So you have to weave those accounts in and around each other to kind of create the narrative.
Well, you wouldn't want all the voices from Supergroove, even if they said hardly anything. It's so many voices.
Yeah, I know. And they're probably all still as hyperactive as they always.
Yeah.
But it was just the sheer amount of great stuff that they were able to sort of recount, and everything that they gave me in return had a weight to it, and contributed and was interesting.
And so may I ask, because there's 2 more, I thought there would be 3 more bands in this second series, but it just occurs to me that if this is a double ep, maybe we've only got 2 more bands to come for this series, or have you got 3 more?
Yeah, and that's getting back to right at the beginning there, where I think I got myself sidetracked, was I wish I just had the time to do more than, it seems lame, 4 episodes in a season sort of thing.
Surely you're thinking about like New Zealand On Air funding, which you'd get in a flash, or you're not interested in that?
I did go down that route.
Yeah.
I reached a couple of dead ends and then kind of got sidetracked because this is a passion project that I do sort of on nights and weekends and the odd afternoons.
I'm right there with you, brother. I'm right there with you.
Yeah. So it takes a lot of time.
It does.
To research, book, schedule guests.
Look,
guests.
I know that you always have the best advice for other people, right? This is me, everyone. You could probably do the same for me. So take this or leave it. The other one that I think is a good idea, because I'm actually thinking about doing a project different to this, something more produced. In terms of the structure and the style, long form narrative like yours, completely different subject matter. Might tell you off mic. Yeah. But I think there's a lot of opportunity in New Zealand. I actually saw you quoted saying similar for businesses or whatever, for commerce to get involved in podcasting that's untapped. And a lot of companies like really small audiences that fit their brand. So it could be something like having a brewery come on or something, and having it, just doing a little liner in that at the beginning as a way to get it funded if you wanted to not go down the government funding route. That's what all those overseas guys do, right?
I know, but there is that, I'm lucky and blessed to be able to use, and that's the other thing.
What about the Manscaped? Oh no, they don't give you any money.
No.
The ball shaver that's on every second American podcast?
I'll use one.
I think the thing is, they just send you one free one, and then I don't know how it works. Anyway, sorry, I'm sorry to associate the ball shavers
or stiffy pills.
Yeah, stiffy pills. Yeah. Hey, Rogan started with the Fleshlight. That's how they got. That's how they got funding.
Wow, didn't he? I remember that.
Yeah.
The thing with using, getting the blessing to use the actual music from these guys.
No, I hear you. Yeah.
Massive.
Yeah.
And that was always and still is a bit of a minefield to negotiate and to kind of try and convince these record companies and these, publishing houses that, hey, this is a document of this artist.
Yeah.
And it is also almost like a ginormous ad for this album. So, I'm not making any money.
I hadn't thought about that, and good on you for negotiating through all of that. That must be your experience and because often people just get turned away, right? So that's great.
Yeah.
Did any of the artists have to kind of vouch for you as well to have that happen? Because I've had odd ones. You just reminded me. I can't think of specifics, but when you listen to a show, it's high production, whatever, otherwise a podcast, and then they make reference to a specific music or era or whatever. Or even a band. And let's say, I think there was one where they talked about Rage Against the Machine in that era, and then they play one of those horrible, almost like, those old CD sound-alike things they used to have at every radio station. So I hear you. But, sorry, getting off track a little, with your project, you just have to have the music in there. You kind of have to, right?
That was a struggle.
It's a character,
It was. I considered not using, and I had conversations with people about, maybe I just don't use the music. So if you listen carefully... This is a little Easter egg for you. If you listen carefully to the She Hard episode, you will hear in behind Johnny and in behind the producer, you will hear some music that I bashed out in my studio that sounds a bit like Killjoy era Shihad.
Oh, because you couldn't quite get all those songs.
No, I got all the music.
Yeah.
But I was at this point where I was like, oh, maybe I'll just hedge my bets. And if it all falls to shit and I can't use you again and I can't
Got you. Okay, because it's the first episode. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just use my own production music to kind of just fill out the background. And then when I listened to it, I went, fuck, that actually sounds kind of cool. So yeah, I produced about 8 production music, like half songs that have a flavor of Shihad's Kill. So I researched their guitar sound, and I used my ear and listened really carefully to the drums and figured out what the drums would kind of, how they sounded. And using modern technology, I was able to kind of approximate that sound. And I think it pretty much lands. It's kind of convincing. It's
use the 90s Shihad AI app for your guitar configuration.
Yeah, there will be one. You
could probably train it. Just start playing at albums overnight while you sleep. We've reached near the natural conclusion. I normally go for about an hour, and always a good sign, Dean, is when there's a bunch of stuff on the list about you that I didn't get to. But I know when a chat has had a good beginning, middle, and end at this stage. But I'm interested. I'm curious because it's probably one of the things you're most known for that people don't actually know it's you. But you also had a funny reaction when I mentioned it. The How Bizarre parody. Do you want to? Have you talked about that much, or you're not really?
Not recently. No.
Was it a weird sort of? So you did Stole My Car. It was a version of How Bizarre, and then it sort of blew up for a while, didn't it?
The story behind that was I was on a breakfast show on this aforementioned rock station, Rock 99 in Rotorua, and it was the B&D show. Me and this guy Bundy, and it was a piss funny breakfast show. It was we were like Nick and Rog from the Rock, but well before. Bundy leaves, and I'm on my own. And I was having a conversation with my mate Gunny, who I always name check Gunny, Paul Gunn, because he gave me the idea. We were in a bar called La Vega. I remember this very, very clearly. We're in La Vega having a beer after work one Friday. And so we were sitting there, and he goes, why don't you just do like a silly version of a song like those guys in Auckland do, those breakfast show guys in Auckland. They do song parodies. Why don't you do something that's charting, something really big at the moment, like, I don't know, that How Bizarre. Why don't you do Stole My Car or something? And I went, light bulb? Because I had the CD single that had been sent to the radio station, and on the B side was the instrumental version. So literally the Saturday morning, the next morning, I went into the radio station production studio and I put on the CD and I sat at the mixing desk and I wrote the lyrics out almost in 20 minutes. The first version didn't have any swearing in it. Then I dropped in some bastards and blah, blah, blah.
Edgy at the time.
Edgy. And played it to my friend who was on air at the time. When he had tears rolling down his cheeks from laughing so hard, I thought, I'm onto something here.
So did you sing it?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought, look, maybe someone's done a mime of it online.
Now, if that was released today, I'd be run out of town as a racist.
Right.
But back then, it was another time. It was a different time.
Well, a couple of Māori kids must have lip-synced it, because you must be aware there's a video online that looks very much like they're doing it.
Yeah, there's lots of them. So I put it on the radio on the Monday morning, and it got a really good response. This was on a rock station too.
Yeah.
I gave it to the guys next door at Geyserland FM, or they were called Classic Hits then, I think. I gave it to the breakfast show. They played it 3 times. Then the phone started ringing off the hook. Play that song again, play that song again, play that song again. People were coming into the radio station with blank cassettes going, can you give me a copy of that song?
This is also a story about how much less media we had in New Zealand then. People were like, yes.
I did have a guy come to the radio station and say, do you want to publish it? I don't know how he thought he could do that, but
some P.T. Barnum guy who's never produced a record before. Hey, you want to publish that? She disappears out of town on the next train. Hey, listen, it's been a great chat. I really, really dig the series, bro. Like, it's one of those things, if you release 10 in a row. I chop them all. I tend to binge podcasts more than TV shows. So well done. It ticks a whole lot of boxes. Sounds great. Great stories and really well put together. So congrats. I look forward to hearing the next ones.
Go nuts.